Lighting is probably the most important thing you can do in a 3D animation program, and getting a handle on the basics is what we're going to try to do with this little tutorial. I'm not an expert in any way, but these thoughts and ideas that might spur your own creativity and imagination and help you with some animation projects you might be doing in the future. So let's talk about some lighting basics and how to get started utilizing lighting in iClone. I always, of course, start with a blank project, and let's take a look at our scene and see what is created from the very beginning. We have something called a shadow catcher, we have some lights, and we have what they like to call floor shadow. So let's put an actor, typical CC character, on our stage, and let's take a look at things. We have our lights. We can turn them off and turn them back on. We have what we call a floor shadow. Now it's hard to see the floor shadow, but if you go over here and turn on a background image, you can see there's a shadow created. You can also see it if you change your background color. Now there's no object here. This shadow is being created by the floor shadow and the shadow catcher here. And turn that off and turn that on, and we can adjust our shadow. But there's no 3D object. This is a real good way if you ever want to create a ping sequence and you want to composite your character or object into another scene. You can turn on, obviously, make sure these are turned on, and you can render. Let's render a single image ping, and let's make sure our background is not the activated image but just a color background. And if we render a image ping, you can render a sequence, obviously, and we'll just call it, we have one here we've already done. We'll override it and we'll look in Photoshop, and you can see that we actually have a shadow here that was created on a transparent background. So we could composite this image easily into another series of images or background. So that's kind of a nice feature that we have with that, but typically I'm not interested in doing that, so I typically will turn these items off because we're going to build a set to work with, and we'll be actually casting shadows. Now, when those are turned on, they can be adjusted somewhat. Over here in our shadow, obviously we can crank our shadow quality up, and if you'll notice, the shadow gets much better the more memory you allocate to the shadow mapping. It's very soft. If you want a soft shadow, you might try that method, but typically you want high quality, and you can adjust the darkness there. This will have no effect, and you can barely see it, but there is a little bit of change. Now this is another thing I like to turn on. Just learned recently this is very important to turn on your manual shadow range. Now you can possibly see the shadow changes there. And you can adjust the darkness of it there. But as I say, we're going to build a set, so we're not really interested in the shadow catcher, so I like to delete them entirely and delete the floor shadow entirely as well too. Okay, we've started a nice fresh project, and I have built a simple set simply using the 3D blocks and the wall and floor and I just drug them onto the stage and created this very simple set. Now you'll notice also I changed the texture, and I didn't want any color involved at all. I wanted everything very stark white, so I deleted any textures that would give a color. I wanted everything white so we could see the effect of colored light on the simple set. Brought in another actor. I've given my actors very simple motions. I just came over and hit the Modify tab and put some mixed move motions on my characters, so at least they would be moving in relation to the lights, and we can kind of see how the lights are working. So that's our simple set, very simple, just to experiment with and see. Textures can make a lot of difference for lighting and how the light hits the texture. So I didn't want to be influenced by any texturing at all. And so we have a simple set. One thing we've got here also that's great about 3D, of course, we can have walls. We can fly them out of the way to adjust and then fly them back. So that's kind of a cool feature with 3D, of course. So let's hit Control G and get rid of our grid and take a look at our lights. And let's go back to our scene. And once again, we're going to delete floor shadow, and I'm going to delete the shadow catcher because we actually have now a 3D object for the light to cast a shadow on. So that's our basic set there. And we have, typically when you start a project, you've got 3 lights that are already created for you. And I really like to start from ground zero as much as possible. So I'm going to delete what they call the backlight and the side light and leave for a minute here this key light. Now the key light is basically a directional light. You can obviously create more lights over here, directional spot points and emissive planes. The directional light pretty much acts like a sun, and you have limited control with that light. You can rotate it, basically is all you can do. It acts, as I say, like the sun and kind of revolves around your 3D world. It's great for exterior scenes, but we're going to experiment now here with an interior scene. So it's probably not going to be the ideal light to use in an interior situation necessarily for certain things. So I'm going to turn it off for now. But you'll notice the light's off and we're still getting a great deal of light. Now, we'll talk about that in a sec. The other thing I like to do to set up is make sure I've turned on global illumination. So we turn that feature on. Turn these two, should be on. Let's go down here, check our project out, and see some other odds and ends we might want to turn on. One thing for animation purposes, I like to make sure that's turned on. We won't be talking about that necessarily this time. Rendering, I think we're good. As I said, these are CC characters, very basic, simple. So now let's go to the Visual tab and let's start taking a look at that. As we say, we turned off all the lights, but we're still seeing a great deal of illumination. So let's scroll around. I'm going to turn occlusion off right now. It's automatically turned on. Let's go down here to image-based lighting, and you'll notice that it's usually on, and if you turn it off, now we have a dark set. And I usually like to prefer to keep it off while I'm working with my lighting. So that may be a good thing to do. Okay, so let's add a light to our scene, and we'll create a spotlight, which tends to be, in my mind, the most versatile of all the lights that you can create. It allows for a lot of control, casts very nice shadows if you adjust them right, and just overall a powerful light to utilize in 3D. Now, let's take a look at some of the features of a spotlight and how it works. So let's go over to Modify, Spotlight, Modify, and let's take a look at what control we have. The range, and as you can see with the graphic assistant with the light, when you have the light selected and turned on for visibility, you have this very helpful guide that lets you see how far the light is going to cast its rays. Don't need to go overboard. You can back it off very nicely. And let's say you didn't want that shadow to hit the wall, you might be able to adjust the range where it doesn't cause a lot of shadow, and you up the multiplier, which increases the brightness, and you back the range off and up the multiplier, and you can really control how far the light is going and how bright it's going to be hitting the characters. So you have a lot of nice control. Also, the spot can be controlled with the angle, and the penumbra, I believe it's called. This is the fuzzy area there. Penumbra, I think it's called. That can be controlled to make it less pronounced. Obviously, if this was a stage production, maybe you might have a harder edge to your spotlight. Typically, you want them to be soft and not be apparent as far as the pattern goes. So, a lot of nice ways to place the light. And controls to light the room. And once again, if we crank that range up and back the light off, up our multiplier, we can light a very large space and create very nice shadows. Now let's go over to shadow settings and take a look at that. This will have no effect now with this type of shadow, but we can control the strength of the shadow for a film noir look with very deep dark shadows. As I say, once again, we want to make sure we turn on shadow range manual. That's ideal. I've discovered a few months ago that can cause some problems if you're in auto, but if you're in manual, just make sure you have enough. Don't go overboard necessarily. Just cover the area and make sure the shadows are projecting nicely that way. Another simple thing we can do with the light is, let's go over here to modify light again. We're on spotlight. We can control the color of the light. Typically indoors, I like lights to be a little warmer than outdoors. So you can adjust the color, obviously. This, of course, can be animated. But a little warmer light coming in from maybe outside might be bluer for a blue sky. Or moonlight typically has a blue cast, we like to think, to it. So those are some basic adjustments there for our light. Now, if for some reason you need more punch out of your light, you can't get enough intensity with the multiplier, you can turn off inverse square and it'll really get crazy. If you want to blow out a scene with bright light, you can do it that way. You can still back it off and it'll look fine. But if for some reason you needed more intensity, you can certainly get it there. Will work. Another thing to remember, and it's not obvious here, if your shadows are not lining up properly to the source of the shadow, you could adjust the bias, and many times that will get the shadow to line up with what's causing the shadow better. So be aware of the bias capability there as well. Also ambient light. Now this is an overall light, and I typically don't like to use very much of it. Ambient light will give an overall illumination to the shadowed area. Now to adjust it, we go over here to the setting for our global illumination, and we can adjust the strength of our ambient light. And notice it's acting everywhere. Really can't control where the ambient light is. It's just going to fill up everything. So I tend not to use it, or use it very, very sparingly. Once again, obviously it can be colored to give a color cast, but I like to control that light, and it's hard to control ambient light, so I tend to not use it too much, if at all. Now another thing that will affect the look of our scene and the lighting is what is called ambient occlusion. And by adjusting this, you'll see shadowed areas start to creep in around the corners, which might be a nice effect in many situations. And you have some controls here, and you can certainly just play with them and see what works best, but it gives some nice definition, certainly to the corners. You can see the overall effect by turning on viewing ambient occlusion, and then go back. So use it sparingly, once again, just depending on the scene, but it can also affect the overall look of mimicking a shadow, mimicking a shaded area. Let's play with our key light a little more, and let's change where it is. Let's rotate it and stick it outside and create a light coming through the window effect, like so. Adjust its position a bit there. Okay. And once again, let's adjust the range. And notice, create those shadows, and once again, if you don't get enough punch, then you can turn off inverse square and create a lot of punch. Now, if this was moonlight, potentially in a night scene, like it's kind of turning out to be, obviously we might want to make it a little bluer and create blue effect, coloring the light there. Gives us a whole nother effect. And let's turn off. Now, also, of course, notice we're getting glows around here, and we want to try to figure out how to mitigate and lessen that particular effect. A lot of things go into play when we're working with that. We'll make sure our light's turned on. Obviously, adjusting the angle can help. All these things go into play as to how much that, and part of our global illumination capability is the fact that we have bounce capability. And notice by turning up bounce, we can really emphasize that, which is possibly not a good thing. So we want to use the bounce capability sparingly, and we want to work with all the other adjustments and see how we can once again mitigate some of that leakage, I guess it would be called, or bounce effect. So basically you want some bounce. You just don't want it to be predominant and too obvious and kill the effect that you're going for sure. But it's just going to take a lot of playing around with the settings and getting them to look like you want them to look. Obviously, once again, you can bring up the overall look and ambient settings, but I like to ease that out and don't like to use a lot of that. Now notice some of this, and this is all part of the shadow bias adjustments, and you basically just keep adjusting until it goes away or looks a little less apparent in the scene. Typically it will eventually get where you want it to get, and that's cool. But it's just going to take playing with it. Now we've got a rather dramatic scene going on here. Probably going to want some more light in the room, and we'll do that. One thing that's kind of fun to play with, and I love to play with it, is the fog capability. Now I'm going to maybe do a little fog here. I'm going to adjust these numbers a great deal. And create a haze look, which is kind of cool. And if you'll notice, even turning off the light, we can establish a scene look just with the fog supplying the contrast. So that's kind of fun. Just basically playing with the numbers till you get something you like, but it's kind of interesting that we've got a look with really no light on. But typically we'll want our light on, and we'll want to add some more light. So let's talk about adding more light to a scene. Now before we go too far in our lighting exercise, we always want to make sure that our global illumination area is covering what we're working on. Now this little device here shows us this is our significant work area, and we're kind of working a little further than that, so we want to increase that range just enough to take into account our entire set that's being lit. So once we've done that, then everything else will be potentially a little more accurate as far as our values and shadows and shading and illumination control. So be aware that you check on that before you get too deep. Once you've built your set, it might be a good thing to do first off, and that way everything will be in good shape. So we probably want to add some more light, and one thing I like to do, now we're getting a little bit of nice light on his face from our key light, which is, we'll call it the moon, and but I'd like it to wrap around his face a little more, and there's really no good way to adjust that spotlight to get it to wrap around and cover and light our actor's face much better. It's not even hitting her. We'd kind of like to once again cheat the light a little bit, so I'm going to add, now you can do it a couple of ways. You could add another spotlight, which is probably going to be best, but I'm going to go ahead and use a point light right now just for grins. And a point light has its place. It doesn't cast any shadows, which is crucial to remember. I'm going to go over here and capture that blue, and I'm going to use that blue on the point light as well. Point light's a little hard to control because it's, once again, not causing any shadows. It kind of spreads its light everywhere. But it can be adjusted, and we want to make sure it decays properly. And we can once again crank down its influence range, and we can bump up the intensity so we can mimic the light coming through the window and wrap it around our character just so they get lit and it kind of appears that the light coming through the window. So tweaking this light intensity, we certainly don't want it to hit this wall in any way, so we want to make sure our range is just big enough to cover him, and we might make it do both, but it's possible. But sometimes it's best to put one for this actor if you've got two, and I'm going to hold down Control and duplicate another, and then also have a separate one for this actor, and once again adjusting its position and intensities. And now when we do our over the shoulder shot, it looks like the light's hitting our actor from the window light, and hopefully the same for her also. And by positioning that light, we can create that effect. So tweaking that. So you could use a point light for this, or a spot. So let's try the same thing this time with a spot, and create a spotlight, and do the same kind of thing. And let's change our color to match moonlight coming in. And once again, now in case you didn't want to create a duplicate shadow, which we're getting here, I like to minimize my shadows as much as possible. You could turn off shadow from that light, but I think what we'll probably do is just adjust the range. That way we'll still have a shadow potentially on the avatar as they move around. So that'll probably be a good thing. But by cheating the light source, it still looks like it's maybe the light coming through the window, but we've angled it in such a way that we are actually going to be able to light our character a little better and have much more control of the character. And we'll do the same thing. Hold down the Control key and create another light for our actress here. And we shoot the over the shoulder that way. Once again, the range is just enough so as we're not creating another shadow entirely here on the wall, on the floor. See, we got a shadow happening down here, but by tweaking that range, we're now only getting a light there. So careful tweaking will give you a nice, interesting light. It'll look like it's coming through the window, but it's really not. We're enhancing it and creating a look that way. Okay, just for grins, we've added some cameras, and we have a wide shot, which is a dolly shot for our scene, and then we've got a two-shot featuring the male, and then we have a two-shot featuring the female. Over the shoulder shot, we call them, and then we'll probably add a close-up at some point. So that's typically how a scene would be broken down. Now, we're probably going to want to add some more light. Probably not going to want it quite this moody potentially. So let's think about adding another light and a spotlight once again. The most versatile of our light in our arsenal. And let's go in here and see. Once again, I like the interior lights to be warmer in color temperature than the exterior lights typically for most setups. It can vary, obviously. Now, we could use one spot and probably cover them okay, or we could crisscross with two lights, two spotlights, one lighting her and duplicating and one lighting him, giving us potentially a little more control over the scene, all depending on what you want to do. Once again, I'd like to select this one here. Once again, we may want to adjust the range, but as we take the range down, maybe the intensity is too low for us, so we crank up the multiplier and get the angle that we like. And okay, and now let's adjust her spot and do something similar. And adjust the range. That's the beauty of playing with the range and the multiplier. You can control exactly how far that light's working and where the shadows are, and you can take the shadows down entirely if you choose. So there we have it. We've got, I believe, 4 or 5 lights now working the scene. Got our moonlight, got our rim for the male and a rim for the female, and then we've got a spotlight for him, a spotlight for her. Like so, there we are. And we'll turn these off now. So now we have some different looks, potentially, utilizing standard lights. The spot. Now, something else you might want to do, and possibly the point light would be nice. Let's have a point light. Let's light up this back area here. To give us a little more exterior glow. Don't want it going too far. As you can see, we're killing this area here. So once again, we want to play with that position. Let's move it maybe further away. There we go. Adds a nice little glow back there. And this will probably be obviously a set. Some buildings, trees potentially would be back there. Okay, now that we've added a key spot for each of our actors right here, got them labeled, this moonlight rim can potentially be used more effectively and more dramatically. So let's take a look at adjusting his, if we're going to have this key on him from the front. Let's think about bringing this around more for an edge to really accentuate a nice rim to give more definition to our actor. And moving it around and up and down and tilting, once again somewhat mimicking the moonlight coming through the window, we can create a nice edge to give some real nice definition there. And once again, we might crank up our intensity. Probably don't need to adjust the range anymore, but we can give it a really hard intensity, because any back or rim light you can really crank it up typically and pump it out. And once again, if you want a more film noir look, we can kill his spot there, and it once again creates a whole lot more dramatic look on our actor. Rather than seeing his eyes, if we move it around, sometimes you don't want to necessarily see the eyes to add more mystery to the character. So depending on your angle, you might tweak that a little bit. And it'll be the same for her as well. Now that she has the key up front, you might want to adjust her rim light. And we could really cheat it this way, which is really way off from what the light is actually doing coming through the window, but once again, it will add a lot more drama potentially to the shot. Crank up the intensity. Just giving us enough information on the face. But it gives a nice silhouette outline to the character. And it'll just take a lot of playing around to see, all depending on how your other lights are working as well. Now, as a side note, as you can see, we've set up 3 camera angles for this particular scene, and kind of over the shoulder and over the shoulder, like a typical sitcom setup. But we have 3 separate cameras, and I tend to record and render each camera angle separately. Obviously, I don't use the switcher in iClone necessarily. I record each shot separately, and I light each shot obviously separately. I can now tweak this light a little bit so it's exactly what I want in this scene, and then I can tweak this shot and record it even though it might be just a little bit different from the wide shot. Don't want to tweak it major, but I want to make each shot look as good as possible, and then I edit each shot and choose how I want to cut the scene together in post with my editor. So that gives me maximum control when I'm creating a project, and it gives me maximum control of the lighting. If you watch sitcoms, they're typically shot with three or more cameras, and shot live with 3 or more cameras, and it's hard to light each setup for the camera and make it look as good as possible. They do an amazing job, but by doing it 1 camera at a time, we can certainly adjust our lighting, render that scene, go to our next shot, adjust the lighting, render that scene. And that, of course, will give you maximum control of the scene. Now let's go over our setup one more time before we make some more changes. remember we added a background light, I'll call it, back here to give some blue glow back there, or it can certainly be another color very easily. And then we have a key light for one of our actors, and another key light for our other actor. Could be one, but we've used two to give us maximum control. And then we have a rim that's rimming our actor, and another rim, and then we have our major key light mood setter for the set, which is our moonlight setting. So that's what we're using right now. Now another type of light that we haven't discussed is the emissive plane, and you have some different shapes you can use. I'm going to use a round emissive plane, add it to the scene. Now these are interesting lights. They're a little hard to control. They scatter light everywhere. So let's kind of turn off a lot of our lights and see the effect of this light in particular. We're going to need to adjust it. So it's a top light, and you have an emissive side here, and you have a non-emissive side here. But notice that it really tends to go crazy, and it scatters everywhere. It's very diffuse, goes everywhere, somewhat hard to control. You can scale it and get it to change, and you can obviously go into the properties of that light, and you can take it down here and also get it darker. So there are ways, and you can of course color it if you want to give it a color as well. But it is tricky to control. It doesn't particularly cast a shadow, as you can see. And I like shadows because they give characters dimensional quality. And but it can be used effectively, and if you play with it. And so let's just see how we can play with it. Let's go ahead and turn off the fog, just to make it a little easier to see the effect of the emissive plane. Obviously bounce strength comes into play. Shadow details. Now we're beginning to see some shadow effect here. Very soft, obviously. Not particularly realistic shadow, but for an extremely soft light like this, large surface, that could be an appropriate shadow. So by adjusting these, you can get those strange patterns to lessen. And typically you can find a setting that works pretty good. And begin to get a pretty good looking light. Extremely soft. Now, depending on the sheen of your characters, this will control that. So you can play with this setting. Sometimes just turning it off makes it simple, but you can sometimes get things to look pretty good by adjusting this. For our purposes, I'm just going to simplify things and turn it off for now. But once again, as I say, it's hard to control. I mean, I don't like all this light necessarily spilling on the walls. And you can turn it, but if you want to light your character, then it becomes kind of problematic. One thing you might try, and it seems to work sometimes, takes a lot of tweaking, but let me show you what you can possibly do with this light to control it. I'm going to drag a JPEG. Just control drag onto the stage. Just a JPEG image, makes no difference what it is. I'm going to drag it on here. I am going to obviously get rid of the image, don't really need that. Delete it. I'm going to make it PBR just to be safe. I'm going to make it very dark. Make it very large. Now, see, it's kind of working on this wall here. I want to make it a dummy object. Set as dummy. And for some reason, I would have thought maybe block GI, but emit global illumination helps. And I've created what we call in the business a flag, which is usually a big piece of black cloth over a metal frame or a piece of foam core that we hold up beside a light to flag or block an area, keep the light from casting light on something else in the set. So kind of works. And if you play with the settings on the visual, here we are, global illumination, shadow bias settings, you can kind of get it to work and block the light from the wall and create a flag. So here we are. Turn it off, turn it on, turn it off, turn it on. So make a duplicate. I'm going to drag a duplicate out here. Control D so you can see. And now Control D, and we can kind of make a flag for that wall. So it takes a lot of trial and error, a lot of playing around, but this is something we can't do on the set, is make it our flags go invisible, but in iClone we can. And so now we have a little bit more control over our emissive plane and keeping it off the walls. And you can enlarge, obviously. And just a lot of trial and error is what it's going to take to make it do what it needs to do. It ain't perfect, but I'll just make a duplicate. So now I've duplicated another one. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so now we've kind of contained our emissive plane, which is a fun light to work with. It just takes a little more tweaking, but it can work. And turn our fog back on. Okay. And we got another look. Now, once again, you can make this a dummy, and it's still emitting. There are flags, like so. And the scene without the flags. So there. Might help in some situations. Now here is the basic shot. I've added a little accent light on the walls to help things out a little bit. We're using, in this scene, we're using the emissive round. We're using our flags, and you can see them there. And now if the floor is obviously on your set, you'll obviously have textures and things will be textured. But if the floor, is too light, you obviously adjust the texture, and obviously we can darken the floor simply here and help that out a little bit. And there's our shot there, and there's that. So it kind of works okay for basic lighting setup. And you can see what we've got here. We've got a background light. We've got a spotlight here on the floor. You can't really see it in the shot. Got another accent light here. We're not using these with our emissive plane. We're using our little rim light there. Probably need to adjust this one a little bit. It's getting a little bit too much spill on that wall, and we can certainly tweak that a little bit. Let's highlight that, modify that, adjust the angle, apply a little bit, move it a little bit away from there. Oh, there we go. Back there, ideally. Get it off that wall there a little bit. Tweaking never hurt. And then we've got our moonlight effect. And that's using the emissive round. Now another visual effect you might want to try, we played with the fog, is the HDR effect. You have some basic controls here, and if you can see, it basically will give you a glow, an ethereal glow about it. You have some advanced controls here, and you just need to play with them and see what they do to get the most out of it. But it's possible, you might find a look combination that you like with the HDR effect. Might work. Tone map also, play with it. I've never had great, I don't particularly like the look with the tone map. Once again, you can play and see what you like. It tends to crush the blacks a little too much for me. For some scenes it works really nice, but I tend to work with disabling the type and just playing with the various glow and bloom effects to get something that I might like. So feel free to play obviously with this effect and see if you find something you like. What if there were a campfire here? How might we light that? If you have popcorn effects, let's see what we would do. Okay, I've added a torch fire from Popcorn Effects Library 40, and if we turn it on, obviously it's way too much. So let's adjust and see what's possible. First off, the beauty of Popcorn Effects, you can change your range down to 0 or 1, hit Shift S, and see the effect, which is pretty cool. So let's go now and modify that particular effect. And attribute, here we are. So let's just hit simulate. And now let's take the light intensity way down. Okay. Let's turn off reference. Okay. Now we can move the fire obviously around and it can illuminate, but it's hard to get it to illuminate both actors and put the fire where you might want the fire. Let's say the fire is on the ground. Let's say it's over in this area here. And if we crank our intensity up, it's once again lighting everything in the room, which may be okay, but there might be a better way. I'm going to take the light intensity all the way off for this one. And what I've done is create another version of the fire with only the light intensity. Let's see what that's about. Now, what I have here is a modified version of the torch fire. And I've turned everything off except light intensity. And I found these controls seem to work pretty good. And now what I get when I run the simulation, I get just the glow, as you can see, not a fire. Let me turn off reference. So now, and I can duplicate, hold down the control key, duplicate another, and now I can put the glow where I want it, control it, and we still have the fire in the scene. And we're still getting the effect of the glow. But we have 3 popcorn effects. So that worked kind of cool. We're still getting the nice fire glow effect. And then we can put the fire anywhere we need to and cheat the glowing elements so it works for the scene. And we still have the fire. And it still looks like a great fire, but it's really not causing any lighting. It can if you want to, but this way you've got 2 separate just lighting elements for the fire. Well, there you have it. It was an overly long and somewhat tedious tutorial, but hopefully you got some ideas. Not that this certainly is the best lighting setup ever, but hopefully you gave some ideas. Maybe next time we'll talk about more effects, the LUT capability of iClone now, to give a particular look, but hopefully this helped in some small way.